Today is November 14th, 2023. My name is Charles Suter, and today I'm presenting the topic Preferences versus Addictions. My main message is that preferences seem to offer the most advantages. They offer more choices. And addictions seem to have some problems because they risk letdown if you don't succeed. Now, let me first of all explain what I mean by an addiction. Because there's two types, physical and psychological. Most people think of an addict as someone who is physically hooked and affected by substance abuse. However, there's another type of addict, one who is psychologically hooked and inflexible on their goals and means to those goals. A psychological addiction is based on some irrational beliefs, such as, I'm not okay, which means that if I don't succeed, there must be something wrong with me. That's an irrational belief. This presentation is focused on psychological addictions and what to do about them. People with psychological addictions get emotionally hooked on ambitious goals. They develop expectations of success that are sometimes not warranted by a realistic prospect of success, and they fail to pay sufficient attention to the prerequisite inputs required of success. People with psychological addictions are often disappointed to the point of emotional distress when they fail to reach their goal by their selected means. The irrational expectation of achieving an ambitious goal without adequate attention to the viability of the means or sufficient effort in creating the necessary inputs that must be completed for success sets up the conditions where the addict is going to suffer emotional disappointment if they fail. However, the normal person picks goals based upon reasonable desires and preferences, and then works to complete all the inputs needed to create the sought-after goal. Preferences do not lead to emotional distress if the first attempt fails, whereas if you're an addict, it leads to great disappointment and emotional distress. A person with preferences is not deterred by failure and will try again with a different means. Notice the little table up here. It shows the main differences between preferences and what some people might call an expectation, which I am calling an addiction in this presentation. The main attributes are, where does a person place their attention? Inputs or outputs? Are they flexible? Well, if you have a preference, you're flexible. If you have an addiction, you're inflexible to both means and ends. And what's the response to failure? Person with their preference will take corrective action. Unfortunately, a person who is an addict will likely get emotionally distressed and maybe even keep trying the same approach over and over, only compounding their emotional distress. Also, beliefs. A person with a preference tends to be more rational, has the belief that I'm okay. In fact, that's the reason that they can remain their cool even though they might not succeed the first time. Whereas a person who's got an addiction has probably got some irrational beliefs, such as I'm not okay, I have to do this, or I'm not good enough. So let's take a look at Proposition 1. Preferences for future outcomes are based on rational desirements. Here's what I mean by that. With preferences, you focus on what you control, your inputs to a goal. If you achieve your inputs, you can consider yourself to be successful. You can also consider that goal achievement is just a bonus. Sometimes you may achieve your inputs and not achieve your goal, in which case you might consider that a failure. A person with a preference will simply take corrective action. A mental attitude of preference with the flexibility of means is better for achieving any goal. A psychological addiction is an emotional attachment to the means without flexibility of switching means if another way is found to be better. or if the initial means does not succeed. However, with preferences, you have flexibility in both means and ends. Not only are the means flexible, but so are the goals themselves. Now, most initial goals are a means to higher order goals. Let me explain by that. A job is a means for money. Money is the means to purchase a car. A car is the means for status. Status is the means for identity and self-esteem. Self-esteem is a means for social confidence. So, here's an example. How many different ways can you imagine there are to achieve social confidence without buying a car? Well, if you have a preference, you have a great flexibility. If you're an addict, you got to buy that car if you want to have social confidence. I hope you can see the difference by that example. Proposition 2. Addictions are a rigid fixation based on irrational beliefs. With addictions, you focus on outcomes, which are not always controllable. Without a focus on inputs, failure is a likely outcome. Failure to an addict usually triggers emotional distress and quitting. Here's the problem. If failure is not an option to an addict, then you have a problem. Because some failures along the way to a goal is highly probable, which means that an addict is going to suffer some emotional distress along the way to their goal. A psychological addiction is to either the means or the goal itself can make life limited, because one has fewer choices if they're locked into particular means or ends. With a psychological addiction, one might end up paying a higher price for using an inefficient means to achieve an ineffective ends that might lead to a higher order goal. Failure is more likely to cause emotional distress. As I've already mentioned, with preference, there's flexibility and unlikely to suffer emotional distress. Proposition 3. Ideally, you should replace all addictions with preferences. First, you have to find and remove all irrational beliefs associated with your future goal. In fact, you can test your flexibility by asking, what happens if I fail? If you decide that you're going to be emotionally distraught, then you have an addiction and you need to make some changes. Ideally, you'll convert all addiction-driven goals to their preference-driven equivalent. The best way to test whether you have an addiction in your repository of goals is whether you suffer emotional distress in the past when you failed to reach a goal. If so, you can further investigate the presence of an addiction by asking rational questions of your current goal, such as, have I picked the best means to satisfy my needs and goals, or am I fixated on just one particular means? Am I focusing my efforts on the inputs or solely on the outcomes? Am I willing to try another approach if my first attempt fails? These are the types of questions you need to ask if you're going to find out whether you're a person with a preference or a person who's addicted. If you suspect you have a psychological addiction, you can recover your rationality by doing the following. Shift your focus to the inputs or doing the work. Think of success as completing the inputs, not necessarily as achieving the goal. Remain flexible when you find a better means. Now, my final message. With preferences, you have flexibility of both means and ends. Since life is unpredictable, flexibility is important when it comes to the goals you seek, as well as the means you pick for achieving them. Since most goals are a means to higher order ends, like buying a car leads to self-confidence, flexibility allows you to pick alternative ways to work towards your most important needs without getting locked into one or a few ways of getting what you want out of life. Plus, with a focus on inputs rather than outcomes, you're paying attention to what you can control and not relying upon outer circumstances or luck for your success. Finally, the elements of control and flexibility allow you to succeed more often than you fail. And should you fail, you're ready to try the next best means without getting emotionally upset. Shifting from an irrational addiction to a goal, to a rational preference, only requires a shift in focus to inputs, non-judgment about the future, and flexibility of means. Well, that's all for now. Remember to stay positive. You'll be happier, healthier, and live longer.